Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In series of basic sociology, we are going to talk about conflict theory. This is part of the sociological theories that we started last month, and in this lecture we are going to discuss about the emergence of an important perspective which focuses more on power, on interest, on conflict and competition. So it's very important to understand that there are different ways in which we can understand social reality, and conflict theory is one of the perspectives that helps us to understand society around us. So if we begin with, we see that in sociology as a discipline, the 1950s and almost 60s, we had the dominance of the structural functional approach. In the previous lecture, I talked about structural functionalism in sociology. And structural functionalism, to recap, was an approach which focused on the functioning of the society. The focus was on understanding society with reference to consensus and status quo. So community was seen as kind of value-based, and people were always in consensus with the society, and therefore it was functional for society. This dominant paradigm started facing questioning of the ways in which it was understanding society in the 1960s. 1960 was also a period of lot of civil rights, anti-war and gender protests. So the social political happening around the society questioned the understanding of structural functionalism, and there was a reaction against the value of consensus, the approach that was kind of questioned by the conflict theory. So the conflict theory were questioning consensus, status quo and the community-based idea of a society. The emphasis was more in terms of differences, in terms of how interests differ, how people compete with each other, how because of limited resources there is an idea of conflict and there is a kind of cleverage, is differences, which leads into the idea of the society is both based on consensus and conflict. So if we look into conflict theory as a perspective, we see there are two major strands. One of the strands which we kind of understand in social sciences is to begin with Marx's idea of conflict, and this is kind of the importance of how conflict has been important historically. So the idea that there is kind of a shift or change, transformations taking place, in itself kind of questions the idea of consensus. So the first strand of conflict theory focuses on fundamental material interest of different groups. So this is very Marxist understanding of conflict, where the resources or the material available for survival, for instance land, in terms of food, clothing, are restricted, are available in restricted amount, and people who wants it for their use is high. So there is a competition for the limited resources, and this competition often turns up into a conflict. So conflicting interests are ultimately based on the modes of production, which creates two main classes, and that is we will see when we talk about Marx, his theory of class analysis, which was central for understanding competition and conflict in a capitalist society. If we were to understand conflict theory from its basic idea, we see that it emerged as a opposition or emerged as counter to the consensual view of society proposed by the functionalist theory. So on one hand, the functionalist was saying that society is made up of parts and whole, and each parts are contributing to the maintenance of whole. It was assumed that each part would accept its role and do as it is accepted to do. Now when we kind of look into the conflict theory, it would argue that these parts have their own identity and they could question, they could come into difference with the other. So maybe they are not going to actually function the way they were asked to, and they have their own ways and means. And in that sense, it could be scientifically explained that conflict is integral to societies as much as consensus. So the focus of the conflict theory is to understand how conflict starts, to understand the origin of conflict and then how it varies and the effect that it has on the individual and social relations. So the central concern of conflict theory is basically centered around unequal distribution of resources and power. Power becomes very important because the power or the ability to control the choice of the other will also determine how the limited resources are going to be distributed. So the conflict theorists did not claim to present any general theory of society. So the structural functional theory was a general theory. It was assumed that it would be universally functioning in that manner. The conflict theory now were not generalizing. They were emphasizing that on coercion rather than consensus as the cause of social order. Conflict theory explains social structure and change and argues that actors pursue the interest in conflict with others and according to the resources for social organization. So if we look into the functional theory, it is more from a collective perspective, that the parts are part of the collective and all are functioning in a patterned or a systematic manner. When we look into the conflict theory, here the individual interest becomes predominance. So in order to ensure that individual has access to the resource, the individual will then kind of compete or conflict in order to have access to that. So the individual takes dominance over the collective. So growing unrest in social political world, and this became, so the functional was doing well as long as there was kind of enough resources for the population. Once these questioning of the social political conditioning, idea of disenchantment increased, conflict in the social political realm increased, this kind of initiated the scholarly work or look into more into what originates the differences of interest, resource and power, and it is here where we kind of trace the root of the theory of society. It can be traced back to the work of three main thinkers. So when we talk about the two strands of conflict theory, one is the classical theory which kind of originates from Karl Marx, and then we have Weber and George Simmel, and then when later on from 1980s onwards we have the modern conflict theory which would kind of extend beyond the materialistic understanding of society. Now, if we look into some of the basic assumptions of conflict theory, the first is that conflict in a commonsensical or general way is a struggle. That is the movement or the process through which two individuals or two groups are trying to kind of have access to the resources. So they are in competition over scarce resources, and these resources are the essential, they are the minimum basic necessity for survival. So you need to kind of have it, and therefore you need to compete. The second assumption is that conflict occur over many types of resources in many settings. But the most two dominants are power and economic resources. Why economic? Because economy would then be able to kind of have access to your basic necessity for survival, and once you have your economic resources, then you can have access to the other resources, and power would be also been able to kind of have access to it once the economic resources are available. The third assumption is that conflict result in some individuals and group dominating and controlling, and there is a kind of a systematic pattern of domination which can kind of continue and re-emerge over a period of time. So the conflict is first, that there is a competition over scarce resources, and once this competition, you have a individual or a group who would be kind of considered as able to have access, or in simple term would be the winners. Now these are the ones who would then have better economic resources, more power, and therefore because of economic and political power, they start dominating and controlling those who do not have it. The fourth assumption is that dominant social groups have disproportionate influence on the allocation of resources and on the structure of society. So there is this kind of an dominance, and inequality then starts perpetuating itself. So those who are on the dominant side have access, they will continue to have more and more say in terms of distribution of the resources, and those who were kind of out or were not able to have access to resources do not have any kind of influence on distribution. Now let us look into the three main classical theories to understand the conflict theory. And as I already said, that the conflict theory is kind of always related to Karl Marx, and he has been credited as beginning of the conflict approach, where if we look into his theory, and there have been several lectures on Karl Marx and his work on say his idea of society, class relation, his idea on religion, and so on. So if we were to understand Marx, we know that he gave us a materialistic interpretation of history, and his emphasis was on the struggle over resources. And what was the struggle over? The struggle was over the modes of productions, and therefore those who were able to kind of have access to it were creating a class which had private property and were able to enjoy the surplus value of the production process, created the capitalist class, and there was a opposite class which was the class of individuals who were the working class, and they did not own means of production, and they were kind of dependent on the capitalist for their survival. So this antagonistic or the opposite interest between the capitalist class and the working class created the idea of conflict. And if we kind of go detail into the Marx theory, Marx was of opinion that once this working class becomes conscious of their appropriation or their conditions, they will rise up, there will be a collective conscious, there will be a class consciousness, and they will kind of oppose the capitalist class. Once this violent revolution will take place, or the conflict between the working and the capitalist class will it will bring about a socialist idea, or socialism will exist. So this was kind of a very brief and a quick understanding of Marx. When we look into Marx conflict theory, the central idea is the idea of social class, because for Marx, it was the class as a category or as a group emerged at the point of production. So it was the modes of production, those who kind of owned the modes of production versus those who did not have the access to that. So social class becomes the source of conflict in all society, whether we look into the primitive communism or we look into the capitalist society. So it is a class conflict, and the conflict is between two categories or the two groups. So we see the say in the earlier society, we see a conflict between the master or the slaves, landlords and peasant, and this is kind of has been a part of the history. So historical history, he says, is a history of class struggle. So in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels in the classical statement emphasized the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So the conflict has always been a part of society. It has kind of been responsible for transformation, from shift from one kind of society to the other society. And class analysis is the core of Marxian conflict theory. The class analysis of society as is central to the conflict theory would be centered around the interest of the class. So the interest of the capitalist class is to benefit from the surplus value. That is, whatever is produced by the over the production process, the profit is enjoyed by the capitalist, and the working class are paid as much which is sufficient to meet their basic needs. And therefore, the argument is that it is the labor of the working class which is kind of denied, and the profit is shared by the capitalist. So the ruling classes defend the established and the traditional because they correspond to their interests. So each of these classes have their own interest, and the ruling class will always protect their own interest at the cost of the other class. The notion of two fundamentally opposing classes represents distinctively opposite interests of the two classes. It ends with the conviction that the proletariat is the last of the classes and that its liberation demands the abolition of all classes for a classless society. So, the Marxist theory of conflict was centered around the idea that in order to kind of ensure that the interest of both the classes are able to be met, it is very important to ensure that there is a classless society. And how would the classless society? It would only be through a revolution. Another dimension of Marx theory that impressed the conflict theory, and many theorists after Marx kind of used it to understand the society in industrial, post-industrial society, was the idea of the concept of alienation. And for Marx, it was the concept which was emerging at the root of modes of production. So the advanced division of labor was alienating human beings from their own product, from their process, from the community, and from their species. So Marx was understanding alienation at 4 level, and for him it was kind of central for understand the way in which the conflict of between the two classes ultimately led into the commodification of the worker. The second theory that is very important after Karl Marx is Max Weber. Now, like Marx, Weber emphasized the role of conflict, struggle, and discord in social life. So, Marx was also talking about the materialistic inequality between the two classes. Weber was of opinion that the differences of interest is a pervasive feature of all society, and we need to understand the differences of interest, the difference in terms of the status, in terms of the access to political party, and this becomes the key to understanding the stratification of the society. Max Weber expanded the understanding of social class by expanding its scope to include the entire life opportunities that individuals enjoy in a given society. So Marx was only talking about the economic dimension, that it is the class emerges in a situation of the economic difference of interest between the two classes. But for Weber, this class was emerging not only from the economic set but also from two other related, which is the social status and prestige. So social status was coming in from the social dimension and prestige from the political. So Weber saw that conflict didn't involve the economy per se. That state and economy together set up conditions for conflict. Weber argued that power has significance for every type of social relationship. So while Marx was only talking about the economic conditions, Weber was focusing on the political power, and political power becomes the driving force of social dynamics that places individuals or groups to be mobilized or kind of be a part of the system. As a result of power and interest, it can simultaneously lead to conflict. So political power becomes a crucial dimension for conflict between two individuals or group. When we look into Weber's theory of conflict, it is important to understand the concept of legitimacy. And he says that all system of oppression must be legitimated in order to function. So we understand that the state plays a dominant role in terms of constructing the idea of unequal distribution of resources, and if there is an unequal distribution which is supported by the state, then it is legitimate. It is legitimate means it is kind of sanctioned by the acceptance by the society and state. This legitimation is one of the critical issue in the idea of conflict. Weber gives us three bases for legitimate rule in society. We can also known it as three types of authority: rational legal authority, charismatic and traditional. So it was also very close to evolutionary thinking of the change in power and authority from traditional authority to charismatic to rational legal. So Weber associated modern capitalist society to be based on rational legal authority, and therefore his idea of modernity based on rationality, on rules, on bookkeeping. So the ideal type that Weber talks about is the kind of a model that he gives us to understand a modern industrial society which is based on capitalist economy. Bureaucracy is the institutional setup for functioning, and it's based on rational legal action. If we were to compare Marx and Weber, the first idea where we see the difference between Marx and Weber is class and other struggle. For Marxian theory, class struggle is the most fundamental of all theory, so for him it is class is the central, and all the other kind of conflict emerges from the class concept. Whereas Weber was considering Marx theory as class reductionist, that is, everything is being reduced to the understanding of class. Weber, on the other hand, viewed class struggle as important, but not as the most important form of struggle or the basis for other forms of struggle. He says that it is only one type of the conflict. There could be racial conflict, there could be religious conflict, which could not necessarily be related to class. The second difference is inevitability of conflict, domination and inequality. Marxist theory held that the capitalist class struggle can be eradicated, and once the class is eradicated, all the other forms of conflict is eradicated. Weber was of opinion that some form of conflict will continue to exist in all types of society. And now we look into the third thinker, which is George Simmel, and he was disagreed with Marx about conflict producing effects of capitalism, but he also disagreed with Weber on rationalization. For George Simmel, market-driven society provide individual with choice about what they purchase and how they live their lives, thereby increasing their sense of value and well-being. Market society are more impersonal and perhaps cutthroat. They are also much more free and allow individuals to choose their group affiliation rather than be bound by them. People have choice in the market to secure resources that match the individual need. So he was of view that theory of conflict tends to focus on the integrative or positive effect of conflict. So we are not George Simmel does not look into conflict as disintegrative. He looks into it as integrating the society, creating a group feeling, and it is increases group boundaries, centralization of authority, decreases tolerance or dissent, and in turn increases solidarity. So conflict can lead to coalition, it can lead to successful group formation, and all these outcomes promote integration of the larger social system. And sometime it is also disintegrative, because many a time the conflict can become very emotional and it can lead to violence, it can lead to loss of life. So when we look into George Simmels' theory, he will give us the theory of both integrative and disintegrative aspect of conflict. So with this understanding of Marx, Weber and Simmel, we will have a good idea of the classical conflict theory in sociology. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.